Despite barely cracking the top 70 largest cities in America by population, Pittsburgh is one of the most visually stunning in the country. Much of this can be attributed to the deep river valleys, the undulating terrain, and the steep hills that can be found all over the place in the city, including what is allegedly the steepest public street in the country, one that I had a chance to drive when I was there last week. Pittsburgh's the only major city in America that lies completely within the Appalachia region, and because of that, it grew in a totally different manner than any other typical city. Despite all these hills, there's actually a pretty unimpressive 600 feet of elevation difference between the highest and lowest point in the city. This is low compared to more mountainous cities like Los Angeles, which has closer to 5,000 feet of elevation difference. Even a famously flat coastal city like Baltimore only has a few hundred feet of elevation difference less than Pittsburgh does, at around 400 feet. But what makes Pittsburgh so different is its many rivers and tributaries, which cut deep valleys into the terrain over time. In Pittsburgh, there's hardly any flat land anywhere. Once you get away from the immediate downtown area and the flat riverbanks of the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio rivers, you'll find that you're pretty much always either walking uphill or walking downhill. These unique topographical features played a big role in how the city developed over time. Being located at the confluence of these three major rivers made the location critical for transportation. The location, along with the area's natural resources, were key in the area eventually turning into a coal and steel powerhouse. Development first started along the riverbanks, in the floodplains, and in the flattest sections of the city. Neighborhoods like downtown and the South Side Flats were some of the first to take off. Then, as the city grew, development began to creep up the hills, starting with the less steep ones, and then eventually some bold builders began to take on even the steeper ones. From 1870 to the early 1900s, the population of the city exploded by nearly 600% as the city became a world-class manufacturing and industrial hub. By 1910, the population had reached 500,000, and the area was responsible for almost half the steel production in the entire United States. Until World War II, demand remained strong, with the city reaching a peak output of almost 100 million tons of steel in the early 1940s. As the city grew, builders had more and more reason to take on the steeper hills around the city. They also had the resources to do it now. But the challenge wasn't just building houses on the steep slope. One of the biggest challenges was making transportation possible within the hills. Streets began to be built up the hills, and in some cases, where surface streets weren't possible, other choices had to be made. At its peak, the city had 17 incline railways, also known as funiculars, to facilitate the transportation of people and materials up and down some of the steepest hills in the city. This chart does a pretty cool job of showing a side-by-side comparison of the slopes and lengths of these historical incline railways. Today, only two remain, the Monongahela and the Duquesne, either of which are definitely worth taking a ride up if you're in the city looking for something to do. When I went last week, I took the Monongahela incline, which is a little bit steeper than the Duquesne, but in my opinion, the Duquesne offers a slightly better view. Both are great though, and for under $3 per round trip, it's hard to beat. In addition to the inclines, the city also has bridges. Lots of bridges. As many bridges, in fact, as Venice does. These 446 bridges, including almost 300 of which that are longer than 20 feet, help traverse the many rivers and gorges throughout the city. The distinctive yellow bridges like the Roberto Clemente Bridge near downtown are the most famous, but as you drive around the city, the sheer number becomes apparent. Tunnels are another thing that you'll see more of in Pittsburgh than most other cities. In some areas where traveling over the hills wasn't a good option, builders decided to cut through the hills. There's more than a dozen major tunnels that carry traffic into and out of the downtown area, and exiting these tunnels towards downtown gives some of the most spectacular and sudden approach views of any city skyline that I've ever been to. Like this one that I was able to capture coming through the Fort Pitt Tunnel into downtown. And finally, the thing that I was most interested to check out, the steep streets themselves, and the famous Pittsburgh stairs. The Steel City has a number of other nicknames, one of which is the City of Steps. In order to tackle some of the most dramatic hills in the city and make them just a little bit more pedestrian friendly, the city has the largest network of city-owned stairs in the country. Over 800 public staircases combine for about 25,000 feet of elevation change, almost the height of Mount Everest. The Indian Trail steps up Mount Washington, which used to contain over 1,000 steps and cover 400 feet of elevation change, were demolished in the 1930s. Today, the longest stairs are the rising main steps. When I was there, I had the joy of walking up the steps that paralleled Dornbush Street and Canton Avenue, the two steepest streets, and something that my legs could definitely feel the next day. And there's the streets themselves, most notably the two that I just mentioned, Canton Avenue, which reportedly reaches a peak grade of 37%, making it debatably the steepest street in the country, and the much longer but slightly less steep Dornbush Street, which reaches a peak of 32%, but being much longer makes it much more visually impressive. Since I was there, I figured I had to give Canton Avenue a try, so here's that. And as someone who hasn't really done that much extreme driving, I wasn't really sure if I needed to do anything special to make it up the hill, but I figured it was a dry day and I have all-wheel drive, so if I couldn't make it up, it probably wouldn't be open to the public. So here's my approach to the hill, which is actually coming down a fairly steep street in its own right. I turned onto Canton Avenue, and here's how it went. And pardon the poor cinematography, because as I approached the hill, it was looking kind of intimidating, and I decided I should probably be holding onto the steering wheel with two hands. So, the less than stellar footage. There was a brief moment of panic when the surface of the street switched from concrete to stone, and I wasn't really sure how much traction I was getting, but a little bit more gas and my little SUV made it up just fine. All in all, it was less sketchy than I was thinking it would be, and while I was there was at least two other vehicles that made the trip up the hill with no issues. I know inevitably some people are going to say, that hill's not that steep. What are you talking about? I have hills in my town that are way steeper than that. And you're probably right. It's hard to come up with a consistent way to measure hills across the country. Some are shorter but steeper, and other ones are longer but not as steep, and some are just not well known. This one does have a sign at the top and bottom saying it's the steepest one in the country, so that's where that came from. Also, the hill itself doesn't really translate super well on camera. This picture, I thought, does about as good a job as any showing how steep it really is. For whatever reason, it doesn't always show on camera, but this is the approach so you can see what you're about to head up. Some people might see the hills as a nuisance, but for many Pittsburghers, the hills are a point of pride. One of the most obvious benefits are the beautiful views that you'll get from pretty much anywhere in the city. Unlike some cities where only the fanciest houses have the stunning views, in Pittsburgh, there's houses going for $150,000 that have jaw-dropping views. Now, the downside is you may need to invest a little more in new brakes a little more frequently, but for many Pittsburghers, that's a trade they're willing to make. Another downside to the hills is dealing with the hills in wintertime. They can be challenging enough when it's warm and dry out, but when it's cold and wet, they can be downright impassable. And for a city like Pittsburgh that averages 45 inches of snow, temperatures in the 20s several months out of the year, and only 59 clear days per year, these slick conditions are fairly common. One of the most exciting events in the city is a grueling bike race known as the Dirty Dozen, which travels through the city where borderline crazy bicyclists cover 50 miles and tackle 13 of the steepest hills in the city, including the aforementioned Canton Avenue and Dornbush Street. So as the city grew, and even as developers began to take on steeper and steeper hills, some of the areas were still virtually unbuildable, and because of that, it left physical barriers between neighborhoods. Because of this relative isolation, many of the neighborhoods developed their own individual identities, something that has both its pluses and minuses. Pittsburgh is a beautiful city that developed its own unique identity due in large part to its unique terrain and the area where it's situated. Its bridges, tunnels, staircases, and steep streets weren't just built to look cool, but they were and still are critical pieces of connective tissue throughout the city that are vital for day-to-day operation. Although the city experienced major decline in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s as the steel industry in America collapsed, the city is bouncing back over the past several decades. with its incredible views, its unique industrial history, and its one-of-a-kind infrastructure being some of the major draws for the region. And it may be a little bit controversial for me to say this as a Baltimore resident and Ravens fan, but Pittsburgh really is one of the coolest cities in the country. If you have ideas for other videos that you'd like to see or places to go, leave them in the comments section. As this channel evolves, it's always helpful to get new ideas for future content. And as always, if you like these videos, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll be alerted each weekend when a new video is released.